public policy issue facing our country. And then we go into Q&A, and we're supposed to be here till what, about 7:30?
Yes, sir.
So that'll probably be an hour plus of y'all commenting to me or asking me questions. Sometimes it gets rather spirited. It seems that with Republican congressman town halls, Democrats love to show up. And with Democrat congressman town halls, Republicans love to show up. So we'll see what the mix is tonight as we go through this. I will mention a couple of things as a preface, though. I very much appreciate the opportunity to serve y'all in Washington, D.C. It's truly an honor. But even though it is an honor to serve in Washington, D.C., it is great getting back to Alabama every chance I can. By way of example, I got something constructive done today. I had felled about a 24-inch thick poplar tree in my backyard, and today I got to finish cutting it up into log length and splitting it with a sledgehammer and a log splitter. And that meant that I had something to show for the work. That always happens in Washington, D.C., given the challenges that we face. The one issue that I'm going to focus on is our deficit and debt situation, our financial situation. Quite frankly, unless we do a better job of controlling spending, controlling revenue, trying to get the two to match up, then we're looking at an insolvency and bankruptcy of the United States of America. So I hope that we can still reverse that problem and fix it. I don't know if we can or not, particularly with the things that I've seen going on over the last 7 years. I'm not as optimistic as I once was. But let me cover your country's finances so that you'll have an idea of the situation that we're in. As a preface to that, though, let me mention that typically I rely on the Government Accountability Office for their financial data. We pay them a lot of money. They're supposed to be financial gurus. They give us projections. Or the Congressional Budget Office, same thing. Pay them a lot of money, financial gurus. They give us their best judgment on where we're headed. Or the Comptroller General of the United States, Gene Dodaro. And normally those things come in January. You've got 1 quarter worth of experience in that fiscal year, since the fiscal year begins October 1. And then they project out for the remainder of this fiscal year and a decade going forward. But things have been so chaotic with our country's financial situation that even though, say with the CBO, there's a statutory obligation telling them that they have to get their financial projections to us in January, they've failed to do so. Because the situation has changed so dramatically and quite frankly for the worse. And I feel more comfortable once I get that data, but as a result, a lot of the data that I'm going to share with you is based on GAO or Congressional Budget Office information that is as much as 12 months old. So forgive me for some of the PowerPoint information I'm going to share with you not being as recent as last month. But until the CBO and the GAO and the Comptroller General get their data, this is the best that I have to rely on. I will fill in some of the gaps, though, because there are other entities that are not government related that do make projections. This is your debt chart. As you can see, we're blown through the $20 trillion debt mark. Estimates indicate that we probably will be in the $30 trillion debt range within a decade. Some estimates are worse than that. Again, not the latest GAO and CBO projections. Debt service costs. Anytime you have debt, you've got debt service costs. Debt service costs would be payback of principal plus the interest on it. We've got a problem developing with our interest obligations in particular. If you look at that debt chart, and that's CBO data that's from 2017, you can see that they're projecting under what were better circumstances and what in fact we now face, a roughly $500 to $600 billion increase in our debt service costs over the next decade. And that's per year. $500 to $600 billion more per year by the end of the decade. Again, those are their numbers, they're not mine. But when I say things have started to take a turn for the worse, you've got what I call the Hail Mary pass. That's the income tax cuts that were passed in December, and I can go into why that was done. And we'll see if it has a positive or negative effect on our deficits on an annualized basis. And then you've got what happened 2 weeks ago, where we're borrowing another $300 billion. It's really a crazy thing, okay? For about 9 months, the Republicans had fought with the Democrats. And the Republicans wanted spending at this level. And the Democrats wanted spending at this level. And so we were fighting over who was going to give in and what spending level we were going to have. And the compromise was to spend at this level. Okay? And I'll probably remember this the rest of my life. After the votes, the Democrats, and I voted against it, by the way, because we weren't paying for it. It's a good thing to spend the money, but you have to evaluate the good thing about spending the money versus the cost of that money. And the best cost is paying for it right now by either cutting out other priority items, lower priority items, or else raising revenue, or whatever you're going to do. Okay, but you have to pay for it. If you're not going to pay for it, then perhaps it's not as good as you would think. But talking to some Democrats after the vote, they're kind of rolling their eyes, in the elevator over in the Capitol, going, how in the world did this happen? We fought with you guys for 9 months, and then you exceed our budget request. we don't get it. And so that's part of the mentality we're dealing with in Washington. But the big threat is this roughly $500 to $600 billion debt service cost increase. If that happens, just to kind of put it into perspective, $600 billion, that's about what we spent on national defense last year. Okay, that would be about 1 out of every $7 that we now spend. That would have to be shifted over time to debt service versus what it is now being spent on, keeping in mind that you also have a hoped-for revenue increase that will perhaps offset some of that. This is the annual deficit data. We had 4 really bad years during the beginning of the Obama administration, although in fairness, part of that first $1 trillion deficit is a shared responsibility of George Bush and Barack Obama. Normally I would not consider it shared, but in that first fiscal year, the Obama team came up with $1 trillion stimulus. You may remember that. And so that's why it's really the responsibility of George Bush and Barack Obama, coupled with the newly elected Democrat House and Senate that was elected in 2006. But you can see how we had $4 trillion deficits in a row. Slowly but surely, the House Republicans, when we captured the House in 2010, we were able to force spending constraints, not reductions. As most people think of the word reductions, we were just not spending as much as fast. So there was a reduction in the increase in spending rate. And we were able to get the deficit down to $439 billion. And then the Republicans in the House and the Republicans in the Senate went askew. They went haywire. I don't know of a better way to say it. Now it's bipartisan, let's spend as much money as we can. So we went from $439 billion, which was great progress, to $585 billion, about $150 billion worse from 3 years ago to 2 years ago. Then last year, we went to $666 billion. And this year, you can see what the CBO's projection was just a year ago. $563 billion is what they're projecting for fiscal year 2018. There ain't no way we're going to do that. Okay? The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a bipartisan but private entity. By bipartisan, I mean on the board of directors will typically be an equal number of Republican or approximately equal Republican board members and Democrat board members, former congressmen, senators, maybe the director of the Office of Management and Budget or Secretary of Treasury, people who have a lot of expertise with these kinds of issues. They're projecting this year that we're looking at roughly $1 trillion deficit, which means that the CBO's numbers just a year ago were almost double that, more or less, because of some legislation that has passed the United States Congress. Now, going far out, you can see the best case scenario, according to the CBO, is we're going to have $1.4 trillion deficit 10 years from last year's estimates in 2027. Now the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is saying that it might be as high as $2 trillion a year, a decade from now. I'm still awaiting that GAO and CBO information to see if it corresponds with their projections. We'll see how that plays out. Now, I assume that since we're in Scottsboro, Jackson County, Alabama, that there are a good number of religious folks here. You know, there is some symbolism associated with 666, so I can't help myself as I do this. There you go. Well, you can't quite make it out, but you can see the image of Satan in the background, in case any of y'all know the biblical reference to 666. I emphasize that. I don't want to be sacrilegious, but perhaps we're getting some kind of warning here about really bad things happening with this kind of deficit and debt. This is Gene Dodaro, and again, this is what he stated in January of 2017. I think that's the 2017 quote, yes. He's the Comptroller General of the United States, and basically, when we get these January reports from the GAO, the CBO, and the Comptroller General, every one of them uses one key word, which is accounting word for insolvency and bankruptcy, but the accounting word is unsustainable. You can't do this forever. It's unsustainable, meaning at some point in time, things are going to collapse. So when I talk about an insolvency and bankruptcy and how it appears that your country is headed in that direction, with all the hell to pay that goes with that, I want you to understand that that's not my opinion just coming to you out of the blue. Rather, that is the opinion of the folks that we pay a whole lot of money to. And that's what they're telling us when in writing, in January of each year, they give us their counsel that what we are doing in Washington, D.C. is unsustainable. Now, what does the word unsustainable mean? As I said, that's insolvency and bankruptcy. But that, that doesn't really mean a whole lot to a lot of people. Let me put it down where I think folks can best understand it. Now, I have an economics background. I love reading history. I love trying to figure out what other people have done, or other governments have done, or other countries have done to avoid repeating their mistakes. Okay, you can either learn from your own mistakes or learn from other people's mistakes. And I'm one of those that believes that history is the best teacher. And so in this instance, I would encourage y'all to look at what happened with any number of South American countries over the last 40 or 50 years whose central governments have gone into insolvency and bankruptcy. I would encourage you to look at Greece, which has defaulted on its loans a number of times. Now, Greece is a little bit different from the United States of America. For that matter, different in many ways. But one of the ways that they're different than us is there isn't anybody that's going to help bail out the United States of America. The European community has 3 times bailed out Greece. Even with that bailout, their unemployment rate, because of their past defaults on their sovereign debt, even with the bailout, approximates the worst unemployment rate that the United States suffered during the Great Depression in the 20s. If you're a young person, 18 to 24, their unemployment rate over the last 3, 4, 5 years has centered in the mid to upper 40 percentile range, if you're 18 to 24. That's a lot of hopelessness for our young adults, with the Greek economy suffering from years and years of irresponsible financial management by their elected leaders. Another one that's a little bit more current that you can look at is a part of the United States. Now, if you want to get micro, look at what happened in Stockton, California about 4 or 5 years ago. Look at what happened in Detroit, Michigan more recently. But a bigger one is Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. They have a delegate in the United States Congress, okay? They defaulted about 1.5 years, 2 years ago on $70-something billion in debt. That resulted in over 100 schools having to be closed because they can't afford to pay for the schools, the teachers, the principals. That resulted in their not properly preparing for something that happens a lot if you're in the Caribbean: hurricanes. So when a hurricane hit last year, their infrastructure was quasi-crumbling. Certainly it was not hardened to better protect the Puerto Rican population from non-hurricane risk. Their electricity, their sewer to the extent they've got it, their water supply, basic utilities that we take for granted, they had done an insufficient job of preparing for the hurricane that hit about 6 to 9 months ago, last fall, late summer. That's the kind of consequence that happens when you're headed for insolvency. Normal people, under these kind of circumstances, would have had basically a number of centers spread out throughout the island that people could go to, that would have foodstuffs in storage, that would have clean water available. That's what you do if you have the money and you're budgeting appropriately and you're preparing for worst case scenarios. That's Puerto Rico, and they're wanting us to bail them out right now. Then you've got probably one of the worst examples would be Venezuela. Venezuela experimented with socialism for a significant period of time. Now, if you know your economic history, you know that socialism has never worked in any country that has tried it, socialism versus free enterprise, where the definition of working is you have adequate self-defense capability plus enough of a safety net to take care of your residents. So those two put together. In the history of the planet, I don't know of any nation that has experimented with socialism that has been able to do both. You might can do one, North Korea, strong military, but they got people in the winter eating bark. Okay? You've got others that would provide a good safety net, but by golly, they have no defense capability. And they've just opened themselves up to any kind of invasion from a hostile neighbor. That is the problem with socialism, is it just does not generate enough economic wealth to be able to do both. Well, Venezuela experimented with socialism. And even though they are one of the world's most resource-blessed nations, they have defaulted on their debt. They're not making timely payments. What is the consequence in Venezuela? Much bigger country, about 30 million people, give or take a little bit. Some of the consequences in 2016, their inflation rate was 800%. Now, what is 800%? Well, if you had milk that cost $2 in 2015, 800%, that's $16 a gallon in 2016. That's $128 a gallon of milk in 2017. Now, I'm not saying that's how much the milk costs. I'm just using that as an example of what an 800% inflation rate overall can do to you. That has a tremendous adverse effect on the economy. You've got protests that have turned deadly, rioting that has turned deadly. You've got a disregard for basic human rights principles and governing principles by the people who are in power, who want to keep that power and are willing to resort to weapons to keep that power. You have, let's say, stores. This time last year, it was illegal for you to shop about 5 out of the 7 days in the week. You had a couple of days that were assigned to you to go shopping. That's assuming that there's something to buy. Food is very difficult to obtain in Venezuela if you are a normal citizen. There was a study that came out in 2017 talking about the preceding 12 months, and I'm just talking about what happens with the economy, okay, when the central government collapses. Never mind for this purpose that it was probably socialism that took them there. This happens with any country, whether they're free enterprise or socialist, once you go bankrupt. Roughly 75% of the Venezuelan population averaged a 19-pound weight loss over a 12-month period. That was around 22, 23 million Venezuelans because they could not get the calories, the food, to sustain their body weight. And you can Google that if you wish. Venezuela, 75%, 19-pound average body weight loss. You've got people who want to take care of their families, and they're desperate. They can't get the food in Venezuela needed to support their families. So you've got, by way of example, teachers who have left Venezuela, gone into Colombia, a neighboring country. They've set up houses of prostitution, and they talk about it. You know, desperate situation. They're doing what it takes to get food in the mouths of their kids. And so the money that they earn in Colombia, they don't send back to Venezuela. They buy the things that they need to buy in Colombia, and then hire someone, commonly called a mule, to ship that food and other material things back to their families in Venezuela so that their families don't die. Okay, again, when your central government collapses, there are really bad things that happen to your economy. So there are plenty of examples. I encourage you to look at what we're playing with, the fire that we're playing with in the United States of America as we continue on this debt path. Now, there are lots of different ways to approach this. One is to cut spending. Another way is just to reduce the increase in spending so that we don't increase spending at the kind of rates that we're accustomed to seeing in the United States of America. And then hope that the economy grows more, hence revenue grows more, than the spending rate. Over time, that would solve the deficit problem. So spending has to be a part of the equation, no matter what you're going to do otherwise. Another part of the equation is to have, according to some of my colleagues across the aisle, are dramatic tax increases. When you're looking at $1 trillion deficit, when you're spending a little over $4 trillion, you're talking about 20 to 25% of your operational costs being borrowed money. Now think about that for a moment. Think about your own families. How many of y'all can stay out of bankruptcy if year after year after year, 20 to 25% of what you spend to exist is borrowed money? 20 to 25%. How about your business, where you work? How long would that business stay in business if about 20 to 25% of their operational costs each year was borrowed money? They wouldn't last very long. The economic principles, folks, are pretty much the same with a sovereign nation, except that a sovereign nation does have the ability to print dollars. We could do that. And we could do what Venezuela has done, and that's hyperinflate our currency, which results in us having a whole lot more money. It's not worth as much, but we're paying back our creditors with a dollar that's worth a whole lot less. The adverse effect is, of course, on the economy. And the adverse effect is on the prices of goods that people otherwise would want to purchase. But you could go that route. That makes us different from families and businesses. The second thing then is to dramatically increase revenues by tax increases. Now to do that, and this is a guesstimate, because of dynamic scoring, where you take into account the cascading effects of tax increases, you don't know how much of a depressing effect that's going to have on economic activity, although most economists would agree that it does have a depressing effect. You're looking at maybe a 40, 50, 60% increase in income tax rates to balance the budget. So you've got the spending as an option, you've got some level of very large tax increases to try to do it. And the third option is what's in the PowerPoint right now, and that's to try to grow the economy, and there are risks associated with that. If you look at the 6-decade plus average growth rates for the gross domestic product of the United States of America, you're looking at roughly 3.3%. Since 2002, the Bush and Obama administrations are looking at 2.2%. That's a big difference. Over a decade, the compounding of 2.2% versus 3.3%, which is 1.1%, would result in about $1 trillion difference in revenue for the federal government at current tax rates. So ideally, the solution is to grow our way out of this. And that brings me to the tax cut, okay? Congress is not apt to restrain spending, as evidenced by the $300 billion spending bill that passed a couple of weeks ago that we're not paying for. We just borrow it. 90-something% of it. Congress is not apt to have dramatic increases in taxes. Voters don't like that. You vote for it, well, you might be one of the ones in the unemployment line next. So there's not a real movement to raise taxes, which means the only option left is to grow the economy and try to restrain spending so that we don't spend even at a higher rate than the economy grows. That is the reason for the tax cuts in December of 2017. Now I'm going to use a football analogy. you're down by 5 points, there's 2 seconds left in the football game, and you're at the 50-yard line. What's the play call? Doug Flutie did it, it worked. Usually it doesn't. Hail Mary pass, okay? Most of the time that doesn't work, but you're in circumstances in which that's your best option. And so even though it usually does not work, you're going to fling that Hail Mary pass in the end zone and hope one of your people catch it. And that's what in my judgment, the December 2017 tax cuts were about. Under static scoring, it increases the deficit anywhere from 1 to 1.5 trillion, depending on who you talk to. Static scoring meaning you don't take into account any effect on the economy. Under dynamic scoring, which means with John F. Kennedy, with Ronald Reagan, tax cuts, economic activity increased significantly, GDP growth rates were higher than they historically had been. That's the gamble, okay? Now, what's the difference between static and dynamic? I'm going to try to use an analogy. Static scoring is where it rains in the Tennessee Valley watershed about 10 inches. Under static scoring, you do not assume that water flows downhill. Under static scoring, the Tennessee River will rise 10 inches, even though there's a 10-inch rainfall throughout the watershed. Now, we all know from experience that if we get a 10-inch rain, the Tennessee River is going to go up, and a whole lot more than the amount of rainfall. Dynamic scoring is where you look at the dynamic impact of your activity on other things, the cascading effects. And again, using that 10-inch rainfall as an example, you could anticipate that based on experience that the Tennessee River is probably going to rise 10, 15 feet, and there's going to be localized flooding. That's dynamic scoring. And so we'll see how this plays out. Most people rely on the static scoring analysis when they say 1 to 1.5 trillion. I have seen dynamic scoring analysis that suggests that economic activity, the growth will be such that we actually will reduce our deficit. I'm not 100% convinced that that's going to be the case. It is that Hail Mary pass, and we'll see if it plays out well. So that kind of gives you a summary of where your country is financially. It's very, very dangerous. Hopefully, we'll get a White House and a Congress over the years going forward that will do what our country needs doing. Time will determine whether, in fact, that's going to be the case. So at this point,